Welcome to Context. This is Brad Harris. I'd like to begin this episode by taking a moment to comment on my goals for this podcast. Context has been out for almost a year now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I've received some good questions about its trajectory. My goal with Context is to help cultivate a broad and meaningful understanding of the history behind the important concerns of our time. I'm not here to explore history for its own sake. I'm attempting to apply historical understanding to current issues. Today, we face some serious consequences of the unprecedented progress humanity has achieved over the past few centuries, including extreme technological disruption, accelerating globalization and populist backlashes to it, and an intensifying culture war between those who still believe in the ideals of the Enlightenment and in humanity's ability to make progress, and those who don't. Every book we consider on Context, everything we discuss, is chosen for its potential to clarify our historical understanding of these contemporary challenges in order to better navigate them. And the same question is always in mind. How does this book, this author, this conversation help us distinguish between good ideas, ideas that unite and uplift us, and bad ideas, ideas that divide and diminish us? This is all very much an ongoing work in progress. Every time I finish producing an episode of Context, all I can think about is everything I want to do better for the next one. You can always learn more on my website, bradharris.com. Thank you so much for your support. In today's episode, we're taking on one of the most influential books of the last 50 years that challenged people's assumptions about the purpose of modern education, and in so doing, instigated a battle over the soul of the American university that's been raging ever since. Allan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, published in 1987. The full title of Allan Bloom's book is The Closing of the American Mind: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. And it became a shockingly powerful weapon in his attempt to fight back against what he identified as a morally and intellectually crippling form of relativism infecting America's educational system. Amid growing academic pressure to deny the existence of objective truth, Allan Bloom sought to remind his readers that the goal of education was not to become open to all ideas, but to cultivate the search for the best ideas, the search for wisdom and meaning and the good life that had given birth to reason in the first place. The Closing of the American Mind became an unexpected blockbuster, selling millions of copies and inspiring tidal waves of both praise and scorn. But no matter which side of the ledger his critics were on, all admitted that Allan Bloom's ideas dramatically influenced our expectations of higher education and of the teacher's role. I'm happy to announce that I am releasing a bonus episode on my Patreon feed to accompany this episode and expand on many of its themes. And I'm delighted to say that this bonus episode features the perspective of Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen. She's a historian I really admire, who's an expert on much of the intellectual history that Allan Bloom engaged. In this bonus episode, Jennifer and I discuss the closing of the American mind, along with many other topics, including the ideas of the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the modern search for meaning. It was a fantastic conversation that could really enhance your handle on this material. It did mine. So if you're interested in hearing that, along with several other bonus episodes already on my Patreon feed, head to patreon.com/context. I really appreciate all my supporters for making these bonus conversations possible. To keep the conversation going between episodes, find me on Twitter. My handle is @BradColeHarris. And now, for The Closing of the American Mind by Allan Bloom. What does it mean to be modern? Before we get into Allan Bloom's book, I think this is an important question to consider because understanding the meaning of modernity is critical to understanding Bloom's fundamental argument. To begin, we need to go back in time about 300 years to the 1700s in Europe during the Enlightenment. Now, during the Enlightenment, dozens of thinkers and writers, philosophers and scientists marveled at how much progress was being made in science. European philosophers of the 1700s looked back at some of the very first modern scientists of the 1600s, to people like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, to Galileo, to Kepler, to Isaac Newton. And they saw how the application of reason to questions about the natural world, whether those were questions about, does a vacuum exist? Do moons orbit Jupiter? What are the equations that describe the force of gravity? The application of reason to these questions led to tremendous discovery. We started to understand how the world worked. The philosophers of the 1700s who reflected on that progress sought to apply those same methods of rational inquiry to humanity itself. And from this ethic, they determined for the first time in history that human progress was not only possible, but a moral imperative. Now, this, however, assumed that there was such a thing as objective good and objective truth that human beings could discover. Just as the leaders of the scientific revolution had shown that there were right and wrong answers to how the world worked, they had shown that the earth was not the center of the universe, as Christianity had asserted for so long. The philosophers of the Enlightenment endeavored to show that there were right and wrong answers to how to live a good life, how to organize society, how to optimize human flourishing and human potential. The entire enterprise of the Enlightenment was about using a kind of scientific reasoning to better navigate toward the good and the true, and to discover how far the good and the beautiful, the possibilities for human flourishing might go. They didn't know how long this was going to take. They looked at the world around them and they saw how brutal and nasty and cruel and unfair it was, and how cruel and ignorant people could be. And they realized that this project of enlightenment, whatever it was going to lead to, might take a very, very long time. They were excited about the possibility. They were excited about the process more than the product. Immanuel Kant, for example, he thought that enlightenment might take 1,000 years, and none of them really knew where it would all end up. But what they wanted more than anything was to try to apply the same methods of natural science to human betterment. Amid all of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, the writings of René Descartes, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, David Hume, Rousseau, all of them, the greatest idea to emerge, the overall spirit of the Enlightenment, was that humanity could make progress, that we could improve our institutions, our health, our wealth, our wisdom, that each generation could be better off than the last. This belief that humanity could make progress toward the objectively good and the objectively true through the application of reason, this is what it means to be modern. And this represented the invention of history as we know it. Before this, most cultural paradigms assumed that time was very cyclical. Things didn't change. Things mostly stayed the same generation to generation. The Enlightenment changed that, and it gave us our modern conception of history, that time leads us to better, that we expect improvement and advancement in everything, in our science, in our technology, in the way we treat each other, in the fairness of our laws, in our GDP. This is all second nature to us now. We take progress for granted. But progress, especially the idea of progress, was an invention of the Enlightenment. And that is the central idea of modernity. Now, the modern university grew out of the Enlightenment as the primary institution for cultivating reason in the pursuit of the true and the good. The university explicitly aimed to separate its members, its professors, its students, from society in order to protect those pursuits from the whims of popular opinion and belief and superstition. This is what the institution of tenure is supposed to be all about. The scholar's job security is guaranteed so that he or she doesn't have to worry about the consequences of pursuing truths that may conflict with popular tastes or politics. You have job security for life. Now go study whatever it is you think you should study. Pursue truth wherever it leads you. That's what tenure is supposed to be. And you can imagine how important this would be in eras when, for example, a professor is researching a topic that conflicts with religious belief. Tenure is supposed to protect those scholars from the professional or social consequences of whatever it is they discover and whatever arguments they make based on whatever evidence they find. As Allan Bloom put it in The Closing of the American Mind, quote, "Although universities go back very far, the university as we know it, in its content and its aim, is the product of the Enlightenment. The past was characterized not by ignorance, but by false opinions. People always had opinions about everything, but those opinions were without ground and indemonstrable. Yet those opinions governed the nations and were authoritative. Thus, the problem of enlightenment is not merely discovery of the truth, but the conflict between the truth and the beliefs of uneducated people, which are incorporated into the law. Enlightenment begins from the tension between what people are compelled to believe by city and religion on the one hand, and the quest for scientific truth on the other. To think and speak doubts about, let alone to propose substitutes for, the fundamental opinions, was forbidden by every regime previously known to man." End quote. This was the great breakthrough of the modern university, and this is why the university, in its ideal form at least, is one of the most important institutions of modernity. Now, this is where we can come back to Allan Bloom's argument in The Closing of the American Mind. Because throughout the book, Allan Bloom was expressing his deep concern that these fundamental institutions and ideas supporting modernity were being eroded. There was a very gifted Canadian writer named Saul Bellow who won all kinds of prizes. I mean, he won the Pulitzer Prize, the Nobel Prize, he won a National Medal of the Arts. Anyway, he wrote of Allan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, the following, quote, "The heart of Professor Bloom's argument is that the university, in a society ruled by public opinion, was to have been an island of intellectual freedom where all views were investigated without restriction. Liberal democracy in its generosity made this possible, but by consenting to play an active or positive, a participatory role in society, the university has become inundated and saturated with the backflow of society's problems. Preoccupied with questions of sex and race, academics make their reputations and their fortunes, and the university has become society's conceptual warehouse of often harmful influences. Increasingly, the people inside are identical in their appetites and motives with the people outside the university. This is what I take Bloom to be saying." End quote. I think Saul Bellow provides a good summary of Allan Bloom's concerns here. And if this is true, then it implies the collapse of the function and the purpose of the modern university as we know it. Now, I want to caveat by saying I'm not so sure just how far detached scholars' concerns should be from the concerns of society. We all know that there's a liability in ivory tower elitism, wherein scholars may become so detached from the needs and interests of the rest of us that they just waste resources fixating on esoteric fancies. They try to explain their research and writing to you, and it's incomprehensible. But generally speaking, the point is well taken. The modern university's fundamental function is to protect and cultivate the pursuit of objective truth and objective good through the application of reason and rational inquiry. And the mounting challenge to that fundamental function that Allan Bloom was noticing through the second half of the 20th century signaled for him that a crisis was unfolding. As he wrote in The Closing of the American Mind, quote, "There is no need to prove the importance of education, but it should be remarked that for modern nations, which have founded themselves on reason in its various uses more than did any nations in the past, a crisis in the university, the home of reason, is perhaps the profoundest crisis they face." End quote. So, what was the nature of this crisis? What was Allan Bloom's blockbuster book, The Closing of the American Mind, all about? Well, by the late 1980s, Allan Bloom, a philosopher and professor of the classics who taught at Yale, the University of Chicago, he spent most of his time at Cornell during his 40-year career as an academic. Well, he had come to recognize that, quote, "There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative." End quote. Truth is relative. That contradicted the entire spirit of the Enlightenment, the entire spirit of the modern university that his students were attending. If his students increasingly had come to believe over the years that there was no such thing as objective truth, then the Enlightenment was over, and so was modernity. Welcome to postmodernism. Where was relativism coming from? Why was Allan Bloom starting to see so much of it in his students by the 1980s? This is much of what his book is all about, providing an account of where relativism came from and why postmodernism had swept the university by the end of the 20th century. As far as he could tell, postmodernism and the relativism at its heart was an outgrowth of several different things, but primarily there was a natural tendency for multicultural liberal democracies to emphasize tolerance and accommodation over everything else, with formal education shifting accordingly to inculcate and prioritize that value. Bloom also felt that there were certain excesses of the civil rights movement at play, especially in the form of the armed Black Power movement that he witnessed personally at his own university at Cornell during the 1969 academic year. But beyond these two things, Bloom also wrote a lot about the effects of changing technology, the Vietnam War and the Cold War, environmental degradation, the widespread economic and political pessimism of the 1970s. All of these forces combined to generate an overall skepticism toward the entire idea of modern progress. And more of his students showed up in his classroom year after year with cynical preconceptions about the world and about history. His students were increasingly convinced that all of the evil in the world and all of the misdeeds of the past stemmed from intolerance. For these students, the idea of enlightenment probably would have meant coming to terms with the fact that there were lots of different cultures all around the world, each with their own standards of beauty and good and truth, and none really objectively better or worse than any other. All of the problems of history, all of the human suffering that they could read about in their textbooks, obviously arose when people in power imposed their beliefs and their values on people without power. Intolerance was the great evil of history, and relativism was the road to redemption. As Allan Bloom put it, quote, The danger they have been taught to fear from absolutism is not error, but intolerance. Relativism is necessary to openness, and this is the virtue, the only virtue, which all primary education for more than 50 years has dedicated itself to inculcating. Openness, and the relativism that makes it the only plausible stance in the face of various claims to truth and various ways of life and kinds of human beings, is the great insight of our times. The true believer is the real danger. The study of history and of culture teaches that all the world was mad in the past. Men had always thought they were right, and that led to wars, persecution, slavery, xenophobia, racism, and chauvinism. The point is not to correct the mistakes and really be right. Rather, it is not to think you are right at all." End quote. Bloom had been frustrated by this phenomenon for many years. And in the book, he spends hundreds of pages documenting how an entire academic industry had grown up earlier in the 1960s and 70s that challenged all manner of traditional assumptions about the world and about history. Assumptions about American exceptionalism, about the idea of the West and Western progress, about liberal democracy, all of the pillars of modernity. There had developed a great academic fashion for ism critique, you might say. Conspicuously in the crosshairs was colonialism, nationalism, racism, capitalism. These became the ideas and the features that really came to define Western civilization among this new academic cohort. And throughout the process of studying colonialism, nationalism, racism, and capitalism, many postmodernist scholars were pushing a revised version of history, featuring a narrative of Western oppression and exploitation, and the struggle of marginalized and exploited peoples against Western hegemony. In American history, these kinds of narratives focused especially on the history of slavery and race relations. The entire story of America was reinterpreted in terms of race relations, with America's founding becoming just another cog in white men's global machinery of oppression. Now, not all of this scholarship was regressive or pessimistic or downright depressing. Much of it was incredibly valuable. Much of it needed to be published. Our understanding of history was enhanced by deeper appreciation and greater awareness for the history of race relations and oppression and power struggles, certainly. But the problem, for Bloom at least, was that postmodernist revisionists were completely missing the point about race relations and about moral progress. Bloom remained convinced that, at least in principle, the Enlightenment idea of natural rights, which in America was institutionalized through the Constitution as the right of every individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, gender, or creed, was sufficient to protect the opportunity, the dignity, and the fulfillment of women and minorities, of everyone, to achieve the good that the civil rights movement was supposed to be about. Quote, "In its early days, almost all the significant leaders of the civil rights movement, in spite of tactical and temperamental differences, relied on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They could charge whites not only with the most monstrous injustices, but also with contradicting their own most sacred principles. Blacks were the true Americans in demanding the equality that belongs to them as human beings by natural and political right. This stance implied a firm conviction of the truth of the principles of natural rights and of their fundamental efficacy with the constitutional tradition, which, although tarnished, tends in the long run toward fulfilling those principles. They therefore worked through Congress, the presidency, and above all, the judiciary." End quote. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, appealed to these sacred principles of Western modernity, set down by philosophers of the Enlightenment like John Locke, and then institutionalized by America's founding members like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, Bloom absolutely acknowledged that the modern Enlightenment idea of natural rights did not always protect minorities against suspicion or hatred for their superficial identities. That was where bigotry and racism really came in. Jews hated as Jews, blacks discriminated against as blacks, women subjugated as women, and none regarded as individuals in whom natural human rights resided. This kind of bigotry and racism, this gross ignorance, was still a problem, and, not surprisingly, triggered a counterreaction among those fighting for civil rights that was in some cases nearly as regressive. There was the danger that minorities who became passionate in their fight against what they perceived to be the overbearing white majority might go too far and inflict violence upon innocent people. As Bloom put it, there was growing resistance during the civil rights movement to the notion that, quote, outsiders had to give up their cultural individuality and make themselves into that universal, abstract being who participates in natural rights, or else be doomed to an existence on the fringe. In the second place, anger at the majority who imposed a cultural life on the nation to which the Constitution is indifferent. The Black Power movement that supplanted the older civil rights movement had at its core the view that the constitutional tradition was always corrupt and was constructed as a defense of slavery. Its demand was for black identity, not universal rights. Not rights, but power counted. It insisted on respect for blacks as blacks, not as human beings simply. End quote. Okay, this is sensitive ground, obviously, and Bloom makes some interesting points. But I completely understand how someone could grow impatient with the lag between principle and practice. I mean, if I or anybody I loved were mistreated on the basis of superficial identity, my first instinct would be to burn the place down. But what Bloom was arguing was that overcoming this very human instinct was the entire point of education, to replace that appetite for revenge against people who wrong you with the reason of compassion and true justice in order to secure the long-term good based on the constitutional principles of natural rights instead of reveling in any short-term victory based on zero-sum power struggles. Between these two poles, righteous indignation on one hand and reason on the other, Bloom would say that relativism became the cheap halfway house for pseudo-intellectuals during the second half of the 20th century, a self-contradictory righteousness of apathy. By the time students arrived at the university, Bloom detected that this ethic of relativism had replaced reason among many of them as the foundation for their beliefs. And this was consistently revealed whenever he challenged them on their notions of right and wrong. Instead of answering him with any kind of argument, they simply responded with a combination of disbelief and outrage. Quote, "The students, of course, cannot defend their opinions. It is something with which they have been indoctrinated. The best they can do is point out all the opinions and cultures there are and have been. What right, they ask, do I or anyone else have to say one is better than the other? If I pose the routine questions designed to confute them and make them think, such as, well, if you had been a British administrator in India, would you have let the natives under your governance burn the widow at the funeral of a man who had died? They either remain silent or reply that, the British should never have been there in the first place. It is not that they know very much about other nations or about their own. The purpose of their education is not to make them scholars, but to provide them with a moral virtue, openness." End quote. This is the brand of relativism that exasperated Bloom, and he spends a lot of pages elaborating on the academic foundation of relativism, pointing out how it grew primarily out of that postmodernist revisionist history, along with anthropology and social science in particular. He highlighted how the term ethnocentrism, for example, came out of anthropology. Anthropologists have been taught relativism as a disciplinary method for decades. It's designed to ensure that they remain objective in their study of foreign cultures. But Bloom argued that this methodological approach metastasized into a wider cultural norm among many late 20th century academics, in which all personal cultural preferences were interpreted to be merely accidents of history. There was no objective truth or goodness anymore. I mean, this was the academic environment in which the French anthropologist Michel Foucault became a total rock star. I won't get into him. I mean, that's like a totally different rabbit hole that we could climb down. Suffice it to say that this new norm of relativity fertilized whole new generations of scholars in the social sciences and humanities to reframe all of history and society in terms of the struggle for power between groups instead of the struggle for progress by humanity as a whole. With the only conspicuous sense of moral virtue, the only sense left of the good, being relocated with the power struggle of any group lacking power. So, for example, Bloom wrote, quote, "One of the techniques of opening young people up is to require a college course in a non-Western culture. The point is to force students to recognize that there are other ways of thinking and that Western ways are not better. It is, again, not the content that counts, but the lesson to be drawn. Such requirements are part of the effort to establish a world community and train its members to be devoid of prejudice. But if the students were really to learn something of the minds of any of these non-Western cultures, which they do not, they would find that each and every one of these cultures is ethnocentric. All of them think their way is the best way, and all others are inferior. Herodotus tells us that the Persians thought that they were the best, and that those nations bordering them were the next best, and that those nations bordering on the nations bordering on them were the third best, and so on, their worth declining as the concentric circles were farther from the Persian center." End quote. The irony that Bloom pointed out was that Westerners, which I should mention he considered to be any peoples who had inherited the philosophical legacy of ancient Greek thinkers. Westerners were actually unique in their, quote, willingness to doubt the identification of the good with one's own way. Greek philosophers were the first people we know to have addressed the problem of ethnocentrism. Distinctions between the good and one's own, between nature and convention, between the just and the legal, are the signs of this movement of thought. They related the good to the fulfillment of the whole natural human potential and were well aware that few, if any, of the nations of men had ways that allowed such fulfillment. Their awareness of the good as such, and the desire to possess it, are priceless humanizing acquisitions." End quote. So it's clear that the irony in how academics had overlooked or downplayed the good in this kind of self-criticism that the ancient Greeks innovated was vexing enough for Bloom. But even worse, postmodernists, in particular, established an intellectual tradition he identified that went even further, even beyond relativism to a kind of reflexive masochism. They seemed all too eager to condemn their own culture at every point when practice failed to live up to principle, even while they justified or even praised the apparent failures of other cultures as the products of special heritage of some kind that outsiders were in no position to condemn. As far as postmodernists were concerned, even the monstrous could become beautiful, if only people learned to disregard their own cultural bias. Practices like Japanese foot binding, the Indian caste system, castigating contraception, religious repression of women, even South Pacific cannibalism, all needed to be understood and even respected on their own special terms. In Bloom's final analysis, quote, "Openness used to be the virtue that permitted us to seek the good by using reason. It now means accepting everything and denying reason's power. But an openness that denies the special claim of reason bursts the mainspring, keeping the mechanism of modernity in motion." End quote. For Bloom, reverence for the history of Western philosophy, from Plato's Republic to Rousseau's Emile, was about reminding his students, year after year, of how Western thinkers through the ages had tried to distinguish themselves precisely by seeking objective, universal good. A good life that actually did not depend on where or when you happened to be born, that explicitly transcended that sort of historical contingency. Quote, "The good life and the just regime they taught knew no limits of race, nation, religion, or climate. This relation to man as man was the very definition of philosophy. We're aware of this when we speak of science. No one seriously talks of German, Italian, or English physics. And when we Americans speak seriously about politics, we mean that our principles of freedom and equality and the rights based on them are rational and everywhere applicable. World War II was really an educational project undertaken to force those who did not accept these principles to do so." End quote. Ultimately, Bloom felt that the failure of education was that it was increasingly designed to close our minds to the possibility that there actually are right and wrong answers about how to live a good life and how to organize society to optimize everyone's opportunity to pursue it. To close our minds to the possibility that there really might be better and worse ways of seeing the world and living in it. For him, true openness was defined by a yearning to know the highest achievements of the most talented individuals and richest cultures, no matter where or when they came from, which implied a willingness to also cast aside and even condemn the lowest. Allan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind in 1987 to publicly lament the fact that by trying to become so open to all ideas, Americans were closing their minds to the search for the best ideas. This boded terrible consequences, especially for a society as diverse as America's. Practically every other society throughout history had been established and held together based on shared ethnicity, on tribal affiliation, on its members superficially resembling one another. But in America, at least in principle, that was not the case. American society was to be the epitome of an enlightened society, established and held together based on a shared set of ideas about natural rights. In Bloom's perspective, being an American was supposed to mean, quote, recognizing and accepting individuals' natural rights, through which Americans could find an even more fundamental basis of unity and sameness. Class, race, religion, national origin, culture all disappear or become dim when bathed in the light of natural rights, which give diverse people common interests and make them truly brothers and sisters. The immigrant had to put behind him the claims of the old world in favor of a new and easily acquired education. This did not necessarily mean abandoning old daily habits or religions, but it did mean subordinating them to new principles. End quote. Again, in principle at least, if you wanted to immigrate to the United States, those were the terms you had to accept, in Bloom's opinion. Now, by the late 20th century, on the other hand, Bloom was convinced that Americans were either forgetting that founding principle or simply rejecting it. Bloom worried that the new brand of postmodern civics, quote, paid no attention to natural rights or their historical origins, which were now thought to have been essentially flawed and regressive. It did not demand fundamental agreement or the abandonment of old or new beliefs in favor of the natural ones. It was open to all ideologies. There is no enemy other than the person who is not open to everything. But when there are no shared goals or vision of the public good, is the social contract any longer possible? End quote. An especially interesting passage came soon after this. Bloom considered what the consequences might have been had relativism infected America during the country's early debate over and struggle against slavery. Had relativism prevailed then, he wrote, quote, "It would have made it impossible for Lincoln to insist that there could be no compromise with the principle of equality, that it did not depend on the people's choice or election, but is the condition of their having elections in the first place, that popular sovereignty on the question of black slavery was impermissible, even if it would enable us to avoid a clear and present danger of a bloody civil war." End quote. In other words, Bloom worried that relativism could lead not only to the end of modernity and the end of the university, but to the end of the values that had held America together for over 200 years. Everywhere Bloom looked, he saw symptoms of the closing of the American mind. But it was America's obsession with a late 19th century German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, that bothered him the most. This is probably because Bloom himself loved Nietzsche's ideas, but he worried that relativism was driving Americans to gravitate toward Nietzsche for the wrong reasons, due to misunderstandings of his philosophy. Now, Nietzsche's writings are voluminous. He had a lot of ideas about how the modern world was changing humanity's relationship to the sacred and to notions about what was real. But the basic idea that motivated a lot of his output was that universal truth was an illusion. Transcendent ideas about what's real and what provides meaning, ideas about God, all of this for Nietzsche was nothing more than the product of human minds. Nietzsche's aphorism, "God is dead," is his most famous distillation of this assertion. And all of this angst about the loss of universal truth, about the loss of God, was for Nietzsche a kind of side effect of modernity. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment had revealed to humanity that so many of their ancient beliefs about the world and humanity's place within it were just wrong. There were tremendous benefits to this. Humanity could finally get past so many of its counterproductive superstitions. But along the way, Nietzsche worried that we were also sacrificing many of the ideas that had traditionally given us a sense of the sacred, ideas that had given humanity a sense of meaning. And if enlightenment destroyed our illusions of meaning, then modern humanity might have climbed out of the darkness of the cave only to plunge into an abyss of nihilism. This terrifying prospect really represented just the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophical project. What bothered Bloom so much was his perception that relativists in America interpreted this kind of nihilism as the ultimate conclusion of Nietzsche's philosophy. Especially as relativism slid into nihilism during the Cold War, Americans latched on to Nietzsche's famous proclamation, "God is dead," as a way of signaling some kind of self-satisfied transcendence above the petty mythologies of warring superpowers. These Nietzsche lovers in America, at least according to Bloom, seemed to be interpreting Nietzsche as the man who proclaimed, once and for all, that there was no such thing as good and evil, so there really was nothing worth fighting for. These amateur Nietzscheans apparently were convinced that the man had slain all monsters of authority and finally freed humanity from its repressive myths. Religion, kings, gods, all the traditional sources of guidance on good and evil, on truth and goodness, were revealed by Nietzsche to have been a lie designed to keep people in line and satisfied with the otherwise meaningless commercial trinkets of modernity. But this, Bloom thought, totally missed the point of Nietzsche's philosophy. Remember, when Nietzsche declared that God is dead, that wasn't the end of his philosophical project, it was only the beginning. Again, the project of modern enlightenment would lead humanity to reject superstition, which was good. But in the process, humanity would also reject the mythologies that had always guided their values and their sense of meaning, reject the sacred, reject God, and that was bad. This wasn't any kind of triumph. Nietzsche saw this as a catastrophe, and the entire point of his philosophy was to try and resolve it. For Nietzsche, losing the sacred along with the superstitious represented the greatest liability of modernity and posed the greatest challenge to modern thinkers like him, seeking to restore the sacred and humanity's sense of meaning. Nietzsche did most of his writing between the 1870s and 1880s, when industrialization was exploding across the West, and a major part of his critique was that modernity sought to replace humanity's deep longings for meaning with shallow longings for things, to replace the sacred with the comfortable. And the problem was that there was really no going back. Once one stopped believing in God, one could not simply will oneself to believe again. This kind of brings to mind the whole idea of Pascal's wager. Pascal was a French philosopher and mathematician from the 1600s, and he proposed that you should believe in God. And here's why. If you do believe in God, and he ends up not existing, no harm done. Worst case, you lived a pious life. But if you don't believe in God, and he does end up existing, well, then you're damned for all eternity, probably. But that entire wager assumes that you can choose what to believe. Can you? I mean, if you have hard evidence that some object exists, can you choose to believe that it doesn't exist? Is that actually a choice that you're free to make? On the other hand, if you have good evidence that something does not exist, can you just decide to believe that it does? Nietzsche didn't think so. Nietzsche didn't buy in to Pascal's wager. This is why his proclamation, God is dead, represented to him such a catastrophe for the spiritual fulfillment, for the soul of modern humanity. There was no going back. For modern humanity to continue to satisfy its yearning for meaning and for the sacred, we would have to find a new way forward alone. The analogy of Christmas actually helps explain how Bloom felt that modern Nietzsche enthusiasts were misunderstanding him. Christmas is actually a perfect example, but in order to use this example, I want to give you a heads up. If any children happen to be present right now with you while you're listening to this episode, they should probably leave because we're going to discuss Christmas as adults. So please take a moment to make sure all children are not present. Okay, as long as the coast is clear, now that we're alone, do you remember when you learned that Santa Claus wasn't real? So here's how this whole Christmas analogy works. I don't know how you learned about the truth of Santa Claus, but the way that I learned was that my older sister told me that Santa wasn't real with a kind of triumph in her voice. Bloom's interpretation of how Americans misunderstood Nietzsche was just like that. They thought of Nietzsche as like the older sibling, expressing a kind of triumphant nihilism to the younger sibling. "Aha! Santa isn't real! How naive you are, and how wonderful it is for me to shatter your ignorance." But Nietzsche was actually more like the younger child, realizing that Santa wasn't real and being devastated by that knowledge. It's sad. It's sad, right? When you're a little kid and you realize Santa isn't real. At least it was sad for me. Anyway, the analogy is that Nietzsche is better understood as the younger child being really sad, devastated even, to learn that Santa isn't real. And once you know he isn't real, it's like you kind of knew it all along. In any case, you can't will yourself to just believe in him again just because you might want to. That's a one-way door. But what happens when we learn that Santa isn't real? Do we discard Christmas altogether? Act like the whole thing was just a sham? Throw the baby out with the bathwater and be done with Christmas forever? Do we become holiday nihilists? No. And this was the deeper honesty and brilliance of Nietzsche when it came to realizing that the traditional notion of God could no longer be the source of the sacred, the source of meaning. Not to compare the idea of Santa Claus with the idea of God, I know they're incomparable. It's just a helpful analogy considering the new meaning that Christmas takes on after you learn it's not all about Santa Claus. This is where the real potential of Nietzsche's new kind of sacred can be found. When we learn that Santa isn't real, Christmas actually becomes even more meaningful to us. When we're children, the meaning of Christmas centers around the selfish joy of receiving. When we grow out of that illusion, the meaning of Christmas matures into the selfless joy of giving. And that kind of joy turns out to be much more satisfying. So perhaps it could be with modern humanity's sense of meaning. In Nietzsche's philosophy, so it must be. Here's how Bloom tried to summarize what he thought was a more accurate interpretation of Nietzschean nihilism. Quote, "Nihilism is a dangerous, but a necessary and possibly salutary stage in human history. In it, man faces his true situation. It can break him, reduce him to despair and spiritual or bodily suicide. But it can hearten him to a reconstruction of a world of meaning." Nietzsche's works are a glorious exhibition of the soul of a man who might, if anybody can, be called creative. They constitute the profoundest statement about creativity by a man who had a burning need to understand it. End quote. So, Bloom would argue that the best way to honor Nietzsche's philosophical legacy is to be anything but relative. He would argue that we must engage in the search for the good and the true in order to rediscover the sacred and redefine meaning for ourselves. This is the spiritual and philosophical responsibility of modern individuals that Nietzsche tried to crystallize. It's now up to us to make our own meaning. A huge responsibility, but one we have no choice in adopting. And here is where the modern university, education generally, becomes so critical, because the history of civilization, the history of literature and artwork and philosophy, equips us with the tools to take on this responsibility. And Nietzsche knew this better than most. As Bloom wrote, we have access now to over 2,500 years of secular, democratic philosophy, stretching all the way back to Plato's Republic, a rich legacy of rational philosophizing about meaning and about how to live a good life. A literary and philosophical heritage that reached a crescendo through the writings of Hobbes, Locke, Smith, Rousseau, Hume, and the other Enlightenment thinkers. Indeed, accessing this philosophical legacy is explicitly what the founders of America did in their effort to establish the Enlightenment's ideal society. As Bloom pointed out, by the 1700s, once the fundamentals of modern Enlightenment philosophy had been set down, political leaders were finally empowered to, quote, make governments that, untrammeled by mythical duties and titles to rule, serve their interests. The explorations of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau of the origins of humanity's progression from nature to civilization made possible a new beginning in theory, a project for the reconstruction of politics, just as the exploration and discovery of the New World promised a new beginning in practice. The two new beginnings coincided and produced, among other wonders, the United States of America. End quote. For modern individuals to make their own meaning and find their own version of a good life amid so many alternatives, Bloom emphasized the imperative of rejecting relativism and thinking clearly about how to actually answer fundamental questions about meaning and the order of society. The whole point of education was to orient students' approaches to those questions by exposing them to some of the best ideas humanity had produced. For example, why did the founders of America draw so much inspiration from a thinker like John Locke? Why were his ideas about how to harmonize the interests of individuals with those of society so compelling? For Locke, as for all of the ancient Greek philosophers, everything had to be based on the unrestrained use of reason. Only by basing thought and action on reason could individuals expect to order their lives according to nature and facts and objective truths rather than according to the arbitrary force of tyrants or the authority of religion or myth. As Bloom put it, quote, "Through reason, man, as opposed to the man of this place or time, nation or religion, can know the causes of things, can know nature for himself." End quote. So many people through the ages had known the world and lived in it according to the random chance of when and where they happened to be born, who happened to rule them, what god their parents told them to worship. For Locke, the use of reason was the only way to escape that prison cell of contingency. Essentially, he was reiterating for modern readers Plato's allegory of the cave, wherein cave dwellers, never exposed to the outside world, see reality only in the form of shadows on the rocky walls. But when they escape and see the full three-dimensional color and texture of nature, they recognize how ignorant they had always been, or as Plato put it in The Republic, they recognized that they had, quote, "previously been looking merely at phantoms. Now they are nearer to the true nature of being." End quote. Bloom emphasized that what distinguished Locke and the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers from their ancient philosophical peers was their goal of extending to every individual, quote, "what had always been the preserve of only a few, the life lived according to reason." End quote. Modern society was to be a democracy of reason. And through reason, Locke, along with Hobbes, seized on the idea of natural rights as the correct foundation for modern society. As Bloom wrote, quote, "The spring that makes the social machinery tick is the recognition of natural rights, which generates the calculation that if individuals agree to respect the life, liberty, and property of others, they can be induced to reciprocate. This is the foundation of rights, a modern morality solidly grounded in self-interest." End quote. Now, Locke recognized that self-interest might be perfectly natural, but traditionally it could be hostile to the common good. If you happen to be a big guy and also a bully, you could just throw your weight around and take what you want, right? So he proposed that a more thoughtful form of self-interest, or what he called enlightened self-interest, was needed. This was simply based on every individual's acceptance that he or she would be, at some point or another in life, vulnerable, perhaps enfeebled by old age, or sick and needing care, or overpowered or outnumbered. Even big bullies grow weak eventually. Our recognition of our inescapable vulnerability, morbidity, mortality should rationally motivate us to reciprocate compassion, mercy, restraint of excess power. Respect the natural rights of others so that they will respect yours. This is the only viable long-term form of enlightened self-interest, and Locke's idea marked a radical departure from traditional ideas about the rule of law and the just society. Locke's ideas provided the foundation of American government and of the order of modern secular society, but Bloom recognized that a full education extended beyond pure reason. Like Nietzsche, we yearn for the sacred. And Bloom felt that the special purpose of the humanities was to channel students' natural Nietzschean-style longing for meaning, for passion, for spirituality, through the study of great philosophy, literature, art, and history. Locke, even more so Hobbes in his great work Leviathan, had helped to show how individuals' natural fear of destruction and death could motivate their enlightened self-interest to build a secular, rationally organized society. But fear of death, Bloom pointed out, presupposed something even more essential, that life was good, that life was worth living. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French-Swiss philosopher active during the 1700s, was probably the most important Enlightenment philosopher to remind people of this, to remind us that our sentiments, the seemingly quite unreasonable flow of our passions, love, friendship, curiosity, wonder, awe, these were the elements comprising a life worth living in the first place. Bloom emphasized how much Nietzsche drew on the philosophical legacy of Rousseau to reconstitute modern humanity's sense of meaning. If modern progress culminated in the death of God, then the fusion of Rousseau's and Nietzsche's modern philosophy was the antidote to nihilism. Locke and Hobbes provided a philosophical blueprint for a world that was safe but boring, a world where tyranny was finally banished, but where meaning was too, a world that many people today would criticize for its cheap bourgeois materialism, the kind of thing that Edward Norton's character in Fight Club clings onto, and that his alter ego, Tyler Durden, rebels against. A world where you have everything you need, and yet remain spiritually unfulfilled. Rousseau reminded us that our sentiments and our passions, our spirit, those parts of ourselves beyond the obvious access of reason, provided the blueprint for modern meaning. And Nietzsche took that insight to its ultimate conclusion, forcing modern individuals to confront the necessity of creating their own meaning. As far as Allan Bloom was concerned, education in philosophy, literature, art, and history was in the business of guiding that creation based on studying humanity's best ideas. Quote, "The university's task is thus well defined. It is, in the first place, always to maintain the permanent questions front and center. This it does primarily by preserving, by keeping alive, the works of those who best addressed these questions." End quote. The best part about that project of education, about the search for the good and the true, is how it unites us, how it can connect us to each other. As Bloom put it, quote, "The real community of humanity, in the midst of all the self-contradictory simulacra of community, is the community of those who seek the truth, of the potential knowers, that is, in principle, of all individuals to the extent they desire to know. But, in fact, this includes only a few, the true friends, as Plato was to Aristotle at the very moment they were disagreeing about the nature of the good. Their common concern for the good linked them. Their disagreement about it proved they needed one another to understand it. They were absolutely one soul as they looked at the problem. This, according to Plato, is the only real friendship, the only real common good. It is here that the contact people so desperately seek is to be found." End quote. Whether or not his students believed that God was dead, Bloom wanted them to learn that they were not alone. Allan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind over 30 years ago, but his perception of what was happening then as a consequence of the intellectual trends he lamented was eerily prescient. Toward the end of his book, Bloom wrote, quote, It became almost impossible to question the radical orthodoxy without risking vilification, classroom disruption, loss of the confidence and respect necessary for teaching, and the hostility of colleagues. Racist and sexist were and are very ugly labels, which can be pinned on persons promiscuously and which, once attached, are almost impossible to cast off. Nothing could be said with impunity. Such an atmosphere made detached, dispassionate study impossible." End quote. If I were to read that paragraph without knowing where it came from, I'd probably assume it was a critique of university culture in 2019. As much as Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, was a blockbuster when it was published in 1987, did academia learn nothing from it? Do we want our universities, our institutions of higher education, to be places where the pursuit of truth and good and beauty are cherished or not? Postmodernism, relativism, cultural constructivism, these academic frameworks are all at least as popular today as they were in 1987. And the question isn't whether or not the ideas these postmodernist frameworks produce serve this or that group in the present moment. The question is whether or not they serve the timeless needs of humanity, the needs of every individual, generation after generation, to find peace and wisdom and meaning, regardless of who or where they happen to be. I'm Brad Harris. So long.